Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited about this panel and experts in the field that come at this from very different angles. And so I'm very excited to have them share their perspectives with you. My name is Bill Wolf. I am a policy associate at with Safe House Project, working to help advance good policy across the United States at all levels of government, at the local, state, and federal level. And I am really excited for today's conversation around an issue that is near and dear to Safe House's heart, and that is the issue of safe housing. It remains one of the biggest barriers for those that are exiting exploitation and human trafficking. It's a challenge. In fact, I was just speaking with a survivor this morning who was trying to find good housing, was talking about one of the biggest struggles that they had was being able to find housing that really met their needs, right? And was able to really serve them in that moment. And so we know there's a lot of NGOs across the country that are working to provide stable housing, to provide resources to survivors. The federal government has continued to invest in this issue. But there's still work to be done, right? A lot in this particular space. And we're going to hear today about some of the solutions, some of the work that is being done at those levels. And I wanted to just introduce very quickly our incredible panel that we have with us today. First is Meenal Patel Davis, who is with the Houston Mayor's Office of Human Trafficking. And she currently serves as the director of the Mayor's Office of Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence, chairs the Houston 2026 Men's FIFA World Cup Host Committee's Human Rights Subcommittee, and previously served as special advisor to the mayor on human trafficking. Meenal has done an incredible amount of work, and I'm so honored to know her and to have worked alongside her and just seen some of the most innovative solutions to combating human trafficking over the past several years come from Meenal and her work. She is also a recipient of the prestigious Presidential Medal for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Trafficking in Persons. So she is very well accomplished and known across both domestic and international circuits when it comes to human trafficking. We also have with us Francie Rooney, who is representing the Senate Judiciary Committee. Francie has worked tirelessly on these issues, spearheading efforts in the last reauthorization for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, working for Senator Cornyn from Texas. And so really excited to hear from her on her perspective. She is just an expert in really bringing together coalitions of NGOs. She is one of the most collaborative staffers that I've had the privilege of working with on the Hill, and really trying to understand all the different angles that people are coming from and finding consensus, which is incredibly important when we're dealing with issues like human trafficking. And so I'm so thankful to have all of you here with us today. But I wanted to start with you, if that's okay, and just ask, Houston's done some creative things when it comes to solving the shortage of housing options and residential care for survivors of human trafficking. I wonder if you could talk about some of the different ways that you all have tried to build those coalitions and build up services within the greater Houston area.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Pleasure to be here with everyone today. So nice to be connected with you and serve on this panel with you both. So, when I was appointed 8 years ago by the former mayor, her initial charge to me was to focus on direct services, right? We didn't have this robust landscape of services that we have now back then. What we did have in Houston 8 years ago was a robust homelessness response system led by my colleague here at the mayor, special advisor on homeless initiatives, named Mark Eichenbaum. It's actually an internationally renowned model, and he's talked and trained cities across the country. They've literally worked to eliminate veterans' homelessness. They do outreaches, and this is, of course, with all of the federal housing dollars that the government has made available over time, right? So what we decided to do here was build a bridge to an existing homeless housing system That was just excellent. So what that system does, it has about 150 homeless organizations that have come together, and they use a unified way of doing intakes and then giving the person with the intake a ranking based on morbidities, things like that, right? And it's called The Way Home. And this is a federally sponsored, funded program. And so essentially, we're very good here on the ground at implementing The Way Home. And so what happened was we went to the coalition and said, look, how do we get victims of trafficking into this housing mix? How do we get them waitlisted? How do we do this? And so what we did was identify our partner here on the ground, the Salvation Army. It's a part of this big coalition here. The first thing that happens when you go to that Salvation Army shelter is you get a housing intake. Am I saying shelter is the perfect place for a survivor? No, I'm not saying that, but that is where they get that housing intake and get plugged into the system. So what we did is partner with them. We have an annex office at the Salvation Army here, and one of 5 agencies place anybody they encounter in crisis there. The first thing that happens when they get there is a housing intake, and they get their number on this massive wait list. You could be ranked 232 or you could be ranked 14. When we started this, what we found is we had everything in place. People were getting their number, but no one was actually getting housing, right? So when we went back into problem solving mode, we realized we had to change the universal assessment that they used, and we added trafficking questions to it. And that proved to be successful as far as getting people placed. So in the last 6 years that we've had this, what we call the shelter collaborative, we've placed over 100 people that needed housing and served over 600 clients through this collaborative. Housing isn't the only aspect of it. We have a human trafficking psychology fellow and a human trafficking hospital case manager that work in the hospital system. Medical needs are also getting placed. So that 600 number, 500 of them were talking about those services, but 100 that needed housing have gotten it.
That's amazing. And I know that I wonder, just there was a follow on, because we want to talk about what the federal government's doing here in a second, but where has a lot of the funding come from to be able to support those survivors that you all are placing at that level?
Okay, a few places. So like I said, it's already federally funded. The system is already in place. So leveraging it for our use, we don't have to find that extra money. The second place is my small budget at the city, right? We make sure that we pay each of our shelter partners. We have 2 now, not just the Army, but we also have a domestic violence shelter that's on board. Both of them reserve beds for us, which is unheard of, but we pay them a small amount every month. It's literally $750 a month for a total of $1,500 for the 2 shelters. And with that, they guarantee us placement for up to 8 people in each of those shelters. Okay. So the city budget has been one thing, but initially we had this funded by private funders. So it's come from those 3 different sources. And remember, the shelter staff take on these additional responsibilities. So they're also bringing their resources to the table, not just the housing, but their staff that takes that on. So those are the 3 or 4 different places that we've gotten this funded.
That's awesome. And Francie, I'm sure from your perspective at the federal level, a lot of what you are hearing from the NGOs is we need housing, we need residential care for some of these people. And as we mentioned, you worked and really led the efforts to get the TVPA reauthorized this last Congress. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those efforts, some of the things that were in that legislation to really help advance and support the challenges around aftercare and placement.
Sure, we're always trying to move towards both a more collaborative model that is responsive to the needs that our local partners are saying on the ground, and having information and being able to take like big tools, and as you were saying with the assessment tool, like making that something that actually works in practice, because I'm not a direct service provider, I don't have expertise. Anything that I do that is effective can only be effective if I'm a good listener. And then also really harness the broad bipartisan energy in DC about trying to address human trafficking in a way that does meet needs. One of the great things about working on human trafficking policy is that it is one of the last bastions of bipartisanship that people are willing to fund. So right, you have HUD homelessness programs that are directed at victims and survivors of human trafficking, the continuum of care model, which is able to target high-risk populations, including high-risk youth. You have housing initiatives that are funded through HHS, through state welfare agencies. That was something we worked on last year. DOJ has their anti-trafficking homelessness protection issue. I think we're learning more that getting people not just a room, but often victims of trafficking, especially youth victims who have experienced trauma in their childhood. That's a very high need population. They need a lot of services, but those services, I think, but also it's important, right? I think, and I've to message this as that service is still an investment, an efficient investment in the future, because the more you can wrap around somebody when you first, are bringing them into support, bringing them into housing, that's enriching their life moving forward. And also they're less likely to have more encounters with the system. They're less likely to move back through our formal systems. And that's really what we want to avoid. So I think that's the way that we frame it up here. In terms of what we're looking at this Congress, I think that's the one sort of the high side and the low side of being able to get those pre-authorizations moved at the end of last year is I think there is a bit of a lack of urgency from some other members, and especially on the domestic side, because most of those programs were in fact reauthorized. I think there is still quite some focus on some of the State Department reauthorizations and dealing with international trafficking issues, just because those programs did not move, but the work is never done. And obviously making sure it's funded year to year is a huge priority, both for my boss and for other folks who engage in the appropriations process. And that's where my attention is right now.
Awesome. And I actually should have asked this first, but just to level set for folks, because I know not everyone has the privilege of working on the Hill and understanding the crazy workings of Congress, right? But I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to what reauthorization really is, sure, and like why that's necessary. And that's my bad for not starting.
No, and I'm sorry for going right into the weeds immediately. For a government program to exist, it ostensibly needs to be both authorized, which means that the sort of general rules need to be encoded into federal law, and then it needs to be appropriated, which means the dollar amounts need to be dispersed to the administering agency. For trafficking policy, that can be almost any agency. Everything from the Department of Transportation to the Department of Homeland Security has a role in preventing human trafficking and serving survivors. But in my job, most of what I do is either through DOJ or Health and Human Services, just because those are the most tightly involved with a broad variety of direct service provision, although obviously HUD is specifically involved in housing. So the agencies, in order for them to send out money, whether that's victims funding, technical assistance, anything from a broad range of programs that exist, these various agencies, Congress passes an authorizing statute setting up whatever that program is, and then later on funds it. Programs lapse in authorization all the time, more and more now, unfortunately. I think I just like another symptom of the political environment that we're facing. But authorizations are still a really key issue, because an authorization protects the funding of a particular program moving into next year, and also it's an opportunity to rewrite that statute, to improve it, to make sure that it works, and it works for local partners, and make sure it still functions, right? The original Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000. Our understanding of survivor and victims' needs is dramatically different, right? Especially for this population being commercially exploited. So that's what the reauthorization, which are usually about every 5 years, but the term of an authorization is also like an open political question. Ideally, what you do is you have an orderly process. You get a lot of feedback from stakeholders and constituents, especially in this space. You hear from survivor leaders, and then you draft a bill. It's bipartisan. You introduce it. You move it through regular order, meaning you get a committee vote in the committee of jurisdiction, and then you pass it on the Senate floor, and then you have a House companion that also passes the identical bill through the House committee of jurisdiction and then onto the House floor, and then the president signs it. And then at the end, every year when the government is responsible for figuring out how to fund itself, write to the appropriators staff who are responsible for pulling out those dollar amounts, and you tell them, look, the president signed this saying that $100 million goes to transitional housing support for victims of trafficking. Please give them $100 million. And then the appropriators will say, fine, or I'll give you some of that. And it kind of is an open political question. And it's part of what people do up here is advocate for that money. And then that money is then sent out to the different agencies, and then they disperse it in grant, usually in grant funding, but it can also be government contract. And that is like how what I do up here has like a direct role in how people access their services on the ground in Texas, in Houston, and nationwide. But it becomes, so my job is to navigate those intense political winds of making sure that I can get consensus, that what I push for, something that my boss supports, that folks in the state are telling me they need, that has bipartisan support, that has a path forward, especially in this political environment. Most of what the Senate does is on what we call a unanimous consent model, which means that bills pass because everyone's fine with them. They don't go through a formal amendment process on the floor. So that is why what Bill said about the collaborative nature of the process and building a consensus is like the foundational aspect of my work, because nobody gets bullied in what I do on this issue. It's only through building consensus on what that authorizing bill text should look like that these bills can pass. But for example, one of the things that we did, I think I mentioned some welfare system stuff at HHS last year. We had learned feedback that when children and youth enter the child welfare system, that is a really high risk moment. This is not a housing issue, but just first, it's what came to mind. 18 is quite young. And so there are real challenges when you have children who are aging out of the foster care system super early and there's no support and they're just pushed out into the world. And that can be really unfortunate. One of the things that we did is fund and encourage is a small pilot grant program to encourage and permit states to still provide care, like trafficking related services to youth up to the age of 26, who they identify as being at high risk of trafficking because of a variety of factors. So a very small thing, right? Up here you get really, small is still something, but I think that's an example of what we try to do with our authorizing bills is take a very small issue that is having concrete effects on the actual ground for like actual folks who are at risk, for people who are experiencing trafficking, and try to nudge policy in a way that empowers folks who are doing the direct service providing to continue what they're doing to protect survivors.
I really appreciate those comments, because a lot of times this is the people look at the federal government as, oh, that's just where we get our money from. This is where we're going to fund programs. And to your point, yes, there are grant programs and we're appropriating significant amount of money to invest in this, but also just the policy direction, right, on where we can drive and help to leverage where there are small gaps or there are problems in certain systems. And this is where the federal government can really help to step in and navigate some of those. And I know in my opinion, one of the greatest powers of the federal government is that convening authority, right? To bring everyone to the table. And then what you were talking about is that transitional housing, right? So once they're exiting that situation, now there's a desire for independent living. It's very difficult because of what they've experienced. Maybe to your point, they've got a criminal record or something like that then prevents access to other housing resources, or maybe subsidized housing through HUD or other things. So I think it's very interesting to note that fixing the problem with housing is not just limited to the number of shelters that are available, right? Or the number of, we oftentimes hear from a service perspective, like how many beds are available, right? It's not just about that, but also thinking about how does that survivor integrate into the community? How are they able to your point, make a fair living wage, right? What are the other transitional services that we're building into our housing and restorative care programs to make sure that they can be well supported? And I think that's incredibly important. I wonder if at the local kind of city level, are there ways that we can be supporting those? And maybe it's not just human trafficking victims, but also thinking about those that have experienced domestic violence or other types of crimes. Like, how are we working? How are we operationalizing, if you will, that sort of those transitional plans back into the community?
Yeah, so just a few notes, just the power of local government, and then let me know if this also answers your question, Bill, okay?
Yeah.
Because when you have a mayor's office calling a landlord to negotiate about a potential placement's criminal record, it goes a long way. The landlords work with us, right? So our case manager is very skilled at doing that. Now, in the long term, for housing and for workplace opportunities, it is a tremendous challenge. 84% of the victims we see are African American. And I'm not a race expert, but I have to tie it to disparities and vulnerabilities created that are associated at the intersection of race and trafficking, right? In our world, that's what we're seeing down here locally. And so building up an educational background that was impacted by that, building up opportunities and things like that have been impacted like that, maybe down generations, is an additional challenge, right? So here we work on expungement with our law school clinics. We work with the landlords. They know us here at the mayor's office. Our coalition has done a tremendous amount of work because homeless people also come often with records. Expungement here is something that is a bit of a challenge in the state of Texas, right? And so that's a constant battle for us. The other thing we do is there's a great deal of engagement with pro bono attorneys, right, to help with things like that. Now, our challenge comes in when the housing subsidy with HUD dollars runs out. And for us, what we think is the federal government has done a great job providing resources. What is our role in making sure we're leveraging them, right? Are we being innovative? Are we working with the existing systems? Are we leveraging them for the benefit of survivors, even if it's not perfect? Or do we have a certain cemented way of thinking that keeps us wanting to do things a certain way that then stifles innovation and creativity, right? And then at the end of it, even our organizational missions sometimes limit us and how we do things, right? So where, I really would push for the distinction between serving ourselves and our organizations and really focusing on serving the survivor. And what does that mean? Does that mean you let go of something you think you're so good at to make sure they're getting the service they need? Do you advocate for them in these existing systems? So for us, the transitional plans, right, and how it works, it's worked very well for the most part. Our challenges are when the subsidies run out, but again, the advocacy and a call from the mayor's office to extend subsidies, to find the non-federal funds of money where people are
Mhm.
making it available from the philanthropic community, even to continue their housing. Building partnerships with local community colleges for better jobs and better training. That's something we've worked on here as well. And so those are the things I'd say. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? Is thinking about there are these systems, there are these resources that are put into play, but how are we leveraging them, right? Are we putting them to good use? Are we using them efficiently, effectively? And I think that's incredibly important from a policy perspective, right? From, if I could be so bold as to say, from your seat, it's really looking at how are we doing that, right? From a citywide level, because you're boots on the ground, so to speak, right? Like you're in that microcosm of what's happening within that city. And I think those perspectives are incredibly important. And so, Francie, I wonder if you could speak to a lot of the folks that we work with, in particular, the ones that attend this webinar series. They're NGOs, right? They're the nonprofits. They are the ones that are, boots on the ground, the people that Minal's working with. But oftentimes the federal government can seem a little daunting, a little scary. And so they oftentimes think, is there really value in me coming and meeting with somebody like Francie, meeting with you or your colleagues to share what's going on? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of NGOs being able to speak into the work that you're doing on the Hill. And what does that mean when they come talk to you? Is that stuff that you use to craft solutions?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll just draw attention to one issue. My boss is actually the author of the Debt Bondage Repair Act, which was passed on in 2021, which prevents credit agencies from reporting adverse events that are related to trafficking. So like that comes directly from advocacy. Everything that I've done that I'm proud of in the survivor space in my job comes directly from conversations with folks who are telling me what their needs are. I know it can be quite frustrating, right? Like the preferences, the environment up here is like completely different than folks on the ground, and the reasons things can't happen or they happen a certain way are, I think, so odd and often almost silly to people who are actually providing direct services. So I understand why people just want to disengage. But I will say that DOJ has to email me back. Like that's their job. They're not allowed to ignore me. And we have a lot of tools here, not only on our ability to actually like enact legislation, but also to file messaging bills, which we try not to do because that's not really our mission, but it's a way to call attention to an issue. We can write letters. We can have a member of Congress has a tool of their voice and a tool of their attention in addition to their ability to actually enact legislation. So I think that developing a relation and also there's 435 members of Congress. So somebody in your state is going to have an interest in these issues. So I think developing a relationship with a member who is engaged on these topics and wants to do them and sees that it can be a really mutually beneficial relationship because NGOs have needs on the ground that can be met by better legislation. And then members of Congress like to accomplish things. They like to pass bills. They like to get that done. And so having a mutually beneficial relationship that works out for them too, because then they have something that they've accomplished that they own. And so it really works out for everybody. I don't think there's any relationship in terms of partisan politics and that kind of stuff. I don't know. I work for a really conservative senator, and I know that a lot of the NGOs, especially like at this city level, don't share my boss's politics, but they do share the same goals, which is ending the rape kit backlog, protecting survivors of domestic violence, protecting children who suffer sexual exploitation, preventing them from being exploited and trafficked online, and preventing them from being re-victimized in the system if they have been trafficked, and finding them a safe and supportive housing and setting them up for success in the rest of their life. That's my mandate as handling this work. And so I want to hear from people on how best to accomplish that. Plus, these bills they're gonna need to get reauthorized. So yeah, we should try to do that as effectively and correctly as possible and use our congressional authority and in our oversight ability to make sure that the agencies are following the mandate from Congress appropriately. And the only way that we can really be effective in doing that is having information from the folks on the ground who are receiving the dollars and are actually serving survivors.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, right? This is really a bipartisan issue. It's one that I know in my experiences on the Hill, particularly on the Senate side, but on the House side as well, like you have Democratic representatives and Republican representatives that are coming together and really working on these issues. And I just have to say, out of all the folks that I've worked with on the Hill, Francie, you're one of the most accessible and willing to engage in those conversations. So just really appreciate that from the NGO world, being able to talk to somebody that is passionate, but also very educated on the issue and really looking for meaningful solutions. I wanted to go to you because I also, as much as NGOs need to be working with their elected representatives, you made a point early on that I really would like to round out this discussion with you stressing again, and that is the importance of having survivor leaders involved in the conversation, right? And I think those experiences of survivors that have been through these systems that Mino was describing and have experienced kind of the results firsthand of policies and federal government funding and all these other pieces. Could you speak to the importance of involving survivors? I know you're not here on behalf of the U.S. Advisory Council, but it is an example of where survivors can speak into policy, right? And we very much appreciate you being a part of this discussion and sharing your perspective. I was even thinking, as you were sharing these last words, reflecting back on what you said in the first instance, and that was talking about male survivors and how oftentimes we don't think about the lack of services for males or specialized services, maybe women with children, all kinds of different scenarios that may present themselves. And so I think it's important that we are talking to those folks. Really just appreciate the incredible conversation today. Appreciate the panelists, Mino, Francie, Fanis. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, and thank you for your commitment to this work. All three of you, I know, are working day in and day out to come up with solutions to these problems, to inform what we're seeing happening across the country right now. And so just really want to thank you all and thank everyone for attending. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.